There are two sources for this documentary. Firstly, it is based on a secret video footage taken by the Somali Armed Forces while in 1988 they bombarded with heavy artillery and staved with planes the city of Hargeisa. Secondly, it is based on reports from individuals of different ages, gender and profession who survived the total war the military regime waged on the residents of Hargeisa and generally Somaliland. The secret videotape was obtained in the palace of the dictator when the military regime collapsed in January 1991 and the dictator was forced to flee Mogadishu and later the country, ending as a refugee in Nigeria. The footage was taped to inform the dictator, General Mohammed Siad Barre, and other superiors in Mogadishu, like General Mohammed Ali Samatta, how well the armed forces carried out the order of clan cleansing and scorched earth policy of the regime. Of course, the Isab were not the only victims of the regime. Other clans also suffered greatly under the tyranny of the military regime. However, as shown in this documentary, the Isab bore the fullest brunt of the regime's violence when they rebelled against it. The late General Mohammed Siad Barre was the undisputed dictator since 1969 when the armed forces usurped power. General Mohammed Ali Samatta, a former defense minister and vice president, was the prime minister and the leading military strategist when the armed forces indiscriminately bombarded the city of Hargeisa. The men carrying out the order of bombardment on Hargeisa were General Ahmed Warsame Mohammed and his deputy, General Siad Dawood Guled. The regime's order of state violence is illustrated by the words of these two generals in a 1988 meeting at the military headquarters in Hargeisa while clan cleansing and carnage took place. It is from the words of the commanding general, Ahmed Warsame, that we derive the title of this documentary. The words of these two generals and their colleagues bear witness to their intention to flaunt basic human rights and rules of war, including the rights of the wounded, combatants who submit, and civilian population. What they expressed was regime policy, not the cruel actions of rogue soldiers. This map shows the geographic location of Somaliland and Somalia. The two territories are in the eastern Horn of Africa. From 1884 to independence in 1960, Somaliland was a British protectorate. During the same period, Somalia was an Italian colony. This is Hargeisa, the capital of Somaliland. Since it was founded over 200 years ago, it evolved into a major center of business, administration, and culture. It had the first radio station from which the British Broadcasting Corporation, or the BBC, beamed its news reports and cultural events to Somalis everywhere. It was also to this city that Somali poets, singers, and composers came from near and far, introducing a new genre of songs and music. After World War II, Hargeisa became a center of political agitation for independence in the British protectorate. The city is surrounded by mountains and crossed by a river that in the past brought camel herders of different clans for water and purchase of provisions in the bustling markets of Hargeisa. The city's landmarks include the two mountains called Nasahablo and two minarets built by Somali workers in Kuwait. The British protectorate was the first to gain independence among the 5 Somali territories to which the colonial scramble of the 19th century had divided. It was in Hargeisa that the Somali flag was first hoisted on June 26, 1960, as the British flag, the Union Jack, was pulled down. Independence and the new flag were received with great fanfare and celebration. 5 days later, on July 1, 1960, the former Italian colony won independence. The Somali flag was hoisted in Mogadishu on the same day, as the Italian flag was pulled down. Independence and the new flag were received with equal fanfare and celebration as in Hargeisa. On the same day, July 1, 1960, the spontaneous unity of Somaliland and Somalia was officially declared. 28 years later, the unity that started with great hope and expectation took a violent turn when the city of Hargeisa, the birthplace of Somali independence, was bombarded by the Somali armed forces in 1988. Moreover, the youth who back in 1960 welcomed independence and unity in the two capital cities with great hope and expectation, now in active middle age in 1988, hurled bombs, steel and hate at one another. The number of people killed, maimed or traumatized by the bombardment is not as visible as the resulting destruction of homes and the razing of the city to the ground. Why did events take this tragic turn? The people of Somaliland were disillusioned with the Union as soon as it was consummated. The two former colonies inherited different legal and administrative systems. One used English, the other Italian. Even the soldiers and police marched differently. In the contest over which colonial system and legacy would dominate the two united republics, the people of Somaliland, who primarily pushed for unity, conceded to Somalia. They accepted Mogadishu in Somalia as the capital city. Somalia's politicians also took the choice posts like president and prime minister. They also occupied the majority of cabinet posts and parliamentary seats. Meanwhile, frustration built up in Somaliland on the inequality of the Union. The people of Somaliland also shared the simmering anger of Somalia's population with clan politics, corruption and ballot rigging that had become rife in the first 9 years of successive civilian administration. By the late 1960s, the need for change was desperately felt all over the country, although no means of peaceful and democratic transition had been developed. Then on October 15, 1969, President Abdirashid Ali Sharmarke was assassinated. 6 days later, the armed forces took power, abolishing the parliament, herding politicians to prison, nationalizing banks and other private concerns. Many believe the armed forces were behind the assassination. When the military regime embarked on reforms like community self-help schemes, road construction, developing small industries, reversing encroaching sand dunes, majority of Somalis in the two former colonies thought that the military coup was God-sent. But the military coup leaders, who promised to return to the barracks as soon as they restored good governance, held on to power, and the self-styled dictator Mohamed Siad Barre never wanted to leave the limelight or give up control of the national helm. Backed by a heavy arsenal of weapons obtained from the former Soviet Union, including tanks and planes, the dictator ruled with iron fist and herded into prison all those suspected of opposing the regime or its socialist rhetoric. Also impressed by how the Soviet Union, China and Northern Korea controlled their people under a rigid socialist system, Mohamed Siad Barre took the most repressive aspects of these countries. Adopting their personality cult, he also had large posters and billboards present his picture and that of Mao and other communist leaders. In the state propaganda pervading society, he therefore became larger than life, a very powerful authority figure to be feared and obeyed. The failure of the regime to deliver on its promises intensified resentment, and the regime reacted with more tyranny. Soon certain clans became target of repression and terror for being anti-revolutionaries. Their members were frequently imprisoned, tortured and summarily executed. The place of summary execution in Hargeisa was called Barka, close to a hill in the outskirts of the city, where 25 soldiers shot a blindfolded victim whose hands and feet were tied. In 1977, Mohammed Siad Barre found an opportunity to deflect public frustration and growing anger at his regime. He invaded Ethiopia following the coup of Ethiopian military officers deposing Emperor Haile Selassie. The invasion was supposed to detract attention from the failed policies of the regime, settle by force a territorial dispute, and reserve for the dictator a special place in Somali history. But that was not to be. The Soviets, who provided arms, training, and advisors to the Somali armed forces, took the side of Ethiopia in the middle of the war. Defeated and humiliated, the dictator was forced to withdraw his forces. The defeat of his forces and destruction of their hardware also made his regime vulnerable to armed opposition at home. Aggravating the dictator's problems, Ethiopia also offered bases for Somalis who took up arms against his regime. The ISAP, following the Machetan, were the second group who took advantage of this offer by forming the Somali National Movement, an armed opposition against his regime. The SNM, as it came to be known, began with an ill-equipped, ill-trained ragtag militia. 3 years later, the SNM became a formidable guerrilla force, limiting the movement of the regime's armed forces outside of the cities without large convoys. Still, the regime's armed forces continue to be among the best organized and best equipped machine in Black Africa. Worried about the Soviets' influence in the region, the United States came to the aid of the dictator, providing him with arms, advisors, and financial assistance. Nonetheless, the regime could not quell the SNM rebellion. Frustrated by its effective guerrilla war, the regime turned its anger and tyranny on the Isaac population in the cities and the countryside. When imprisonment, torture, and summary execution could not quell the armed opposition, the regime took draconian measures against the population, indiscriminately killing even unarmed camel herders in the countryside. In 1987, General Mohammed Saeed Hirsi, known as Morgan, the man who headed the armed forces in Somaliland and the son-in-law of the dictator, ordered in a letter known as the Letter of Death confiscation of Walisak property, taking over their businesses, displacing them with refugees, and brutal repression of suspected SNM sympathizers. By early 1988, he ordered total war against the population. To carry out this order, soldiers spread out in cities and rural areas, killing innocent people like this family, sparing not even infants. They also carried out other brutal acts, like the dousing of this man, Abdidere, in the town of Gabile with gasoline and burning him alive while he was tied hand and foot. The man who led this operation of brutality is Colonel Yusuf Abdi Ali, known as Tuke. While he subjected the victim to the cruelest and crudest form of execution, the colonel kept the flame alive by spreading burned wood on the body of the victim. Even while this gruesome operation proceeded, the colonel laughed as if he engaged in sport. In addition, Colonel Yusuf Abdi Ali is alleged to have killed over 120 persons and others in groups. It's said that the colonel killed some of the victims by tying them to a truck which, driven at high speed, dragged their bodies on ground, scattering all over their mangled remains. The latter method was used in Somalia by fascists during the Mussolini era. These measures of the military regime escalated to genocide after April 2, 1988, when the two dictators, Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam of Ethiopia and General Mohammed Siad Barre, agreed to end activities of liberation movement each supported against the other. When the Mengistu regime ordered the SNM that used Ethiopian bases to cease fighting the Siad Barre regime, the SNM rank and file and officers decided to invade military headquarters in Bur'o and Hargeisa. The response of the regime was indiscriminate bombardment of the two cities, Colonel Awais Gedo, an artillery specialist, describes why and what had happened.
kadib markii muddo badan dagaalkii u socday cadowguna soo galay magaalada waxaa kalifay in madaafiicda aan isticmaalno haddaba qaabka dhismaha madaafiica goobta waxa weeyaan dhowr xeemood baa kooban qaybta xeynta taliska guud xeynta daamurka iyo xeynta airborka masallaha xeemaha waxaa loo kala fogiyey hadba noocyada iyo hubka kala yaal isticmaalkooda marka laga soo qaado xeynta taliska waxay ka kooban yihiin noocyada madaafiicda kala ah da' 30 ma 30 105 85 PM Kredici iyo PM 20 هذا كامل waxay kooban tahay ma 30 105 koobiyo 120 iyo 85 mm xanta keydka taliska oo ah tan ugu muhiimsan oo ah xanta masallaha waxay kooban tahay PM 20 130 mm iyo PM 3 isticmaalayaa xeemaha wadan kuwa taliska guud kuwa daamurka iyo kuwa masallahaba waajibkan waa kala qaybsan yahay qol walba waajibkii aajil la siiyey inay naafayso ayaa laga doonayaa marka anigu waxa weeye inaan waajibka siiyey iraahdo waajibkina waa aad kadib ayaga inay fuliyaan haddana waxaan filayaa waxaa dhawaaqa aad maqlayso waa madaafiicii tirada toosan oo bilaabatay kadibna kuwii kala ku xigi doonaan
Colonel Abdullahi Sharub led the unit at the Damur and by his words suggests the leaders he wanted to assure on what a good job he and his colleagues were carrying out by bombarding Hargeise.
sidaas ayaa ilaa maalintii hawsha la bilaabay ilaa maalinka maanta hawsheeda halkaas aan uga fulinayna meel fiicanna waa noo maraysaa ilaa iyo haddeerta aan kula hadlayana waa taas weliba taagana waa baxaysaa xabadda
Notice the number of artillery shells scattered near every gun. This number of artillery shots and others we do not see were fired on the city of Hargeisa. General Siad Daoud Guled talked to supporters of the regime, including functionaries from Somalia and refugees from Ethiopia. He justified the mayhem and destruction unleashed on the population of Hargeisa. Three things are most remarkable in this clip. The first is the propaganda which the regime supporters presented as shown by this poster with tired and stale socialist slogans in the midst of death and destruction. The second is the number of educated people, elders and women present in this assembly, showing no outrage on the mayhem. The third is the way General Siad Daoud justifies the genocide. Deflecting responsibility of the regime, he explains it as product of God's will, a predestination that could not be prevented.
لكن مسلوي ومسلوي لا هي إلى الإسلام dadka badan ee ku dhintay Hargeysa gudaheeda baa ayay u qoreen inay sababtaana ku dhintaan saacadaana ku dhintaan sidaana ku dhintaan wixii oo oran lahaa iyo sidaana waxaa inaan ka hortagno taatahay marka ma sugoobis maanta Hargeysa qofkii joogay wuu arkayaa burburka afooda dhimashada dadka iyo sidii taallay oo baabaaday inay u baahan tahay maanta maraysa marxalada in dib loo soo yegleero nolosha
Arda Yusuf Awale is a surviving resident of Hargeisa. She still remembers vividly and with pain her experience of the bombardment on Hargeisa.
lafti ahaantayda shakhsi ahaantayda bil iyo shan iyo toban habeen miyaan ku jiray intii magaalada la garaacayay yaa oonan dhanna uga baxay bil iyo shan iyo toban habeen jaarkaygii ahaa iyo jiiraankaygii way ka qaxeen wax yaroo qadara oo xaafadaha kale ka yimid iyo aniga maalintiina mistijaamaca weyn ee kuweetiga la yidhaah ayaan tegayay ninkiintii alla ku simo meel walba way kaga dhufatay meel walba way ka duqaysay meel walba way ka dumisay masaajid iyo guri iyo midna umay kala aabayeen islaami sidoodii noolmay dagaalamay waxaad garatay ma meel walba way dayarna bas u fadhiya halkaa ka soo galay halkaa ka soo galo halkaa ka soo galay kaan anigu u weynayay saddex maqsin baa hayda saddexdii maqsin baa sidaasoo kale gambad anigoo ugu fadhiya subax ugu fadhiya iyo maqaadiirta weeliye dee waqti aan dhammaanine aan sidii ad shaah yar karsatigo digada u baxo in yaroo soo qaada dhuxula gambarkaan ka kacay ilaahay weligeena intaa ka kala jeexday barka ku waxuma karsanay fiirima qabto nafsadu iyo niyadu siyelmay baanahay goormay kugu dhaceen baan leeyahay maalintii kolkaan guriga aroortii waagii igu bariyeen kolkaan arko jabhadu halkaa maraysa maalin u yeedhana waxaan dhahdaa waryaadahee waxaan idin leeyahay anigoo dibadda jooga hadday talaya qabsato uu igu dhaco ciiday iga xireeyeen ciidaasina u cunaysa dadka u boobaysa qofkii ciidaa cunaysa meydkii oo meesha buux haa qofkii intaanu bu'inba ma ku dhacday ma dhacay ciidaa kala boobaysa yaa waxaan iga xireeya waa dibadiina ciidiyay cunine yaa hadday igu dhacdo عاشبا ليش إلهي ويجبد إلهي ويجبد
She's Eid Chama, a survivor, a clan leader, and a resident of Hargeisa.
marka waxa dimanayay oo dadka marka madfac iyo kaaruuba ay leeyeen dadkii shicibka ahaa anigu waxaan u soo joogay iyagoo dadka aad moodo in haddii ilaahay aaday dambe isu jiraan tallaabo dadka madfac ku dhaca magaalada madfac waxa lagaga soo ridayay halkan goobtan taaganahay ee warshada kabista goobta yar saaran baa lagaga soo ridayay waanu arkaynay madaafiicda halka soo dhacay guriga markuu qaaciisa soo baxayo marka dadku sida loo xaaqayay uu imanayna qiyaas male.
This is Ali Wassaman, a survivor and a businessman.
igu noogu sii daraa anigu waxaan xusuusanahay markii ay magaaladii inta lagu furay madaafiic oo loo kala eegay wax soo galay wax kala la eegin ayaa annagiina nagu khasabtay xaggii madaafiicdu kas ku dhacaysay ayaa nagu khasabtay inaan marro sidii mala halkaasaa idin aku baxsay wax kolka dayuuradu marna dawladdu baa fushaysa marka kalena madaafiic lagaga dhigay laga soo madaaq iyo ma garanaysaa in daamurka ayaa ku dhacayay magaalada oo dhan gebigeedu dhammaan raqiiq bay noqotay dabeedna sidaasaan anagu magaalada wixii ka bixi karayay wixii kala u dhintay wixii ka baxayana dee ulahaas waynu baxay.
This is Dr. Ahmed Umar Askar, a survivor and a medical doctor who had close and sustained contact with the victims of the bombardment.
maalintii markii dagaalkii halkii ka bilaabay anagu waxaan noqonnay crossfire artillery tank hub yar yar wax walba waxaan noqonnay meeshii mas'uuliyadda crossfire ayaan kala guriga waxaan gelaynay karbadhina saddex cisho ayaa dagaalmaysa saddex cisho aan joognay ugu soo
saddex cisho la garaacayo
wax walba lagu soo riday markaasaan karbad dhanka aan isdhaahno rasaasta waa ku yartay ayaan mas'uuliyadda waxaan ahayn ilaa dhowr iyo toban caruurtaydii dadka loo ehelaya sarkul boqol kale waxay ugu dareed marka sekadihii naga dambeeyey utaangi ku qarxa halkaa lagu qarxiyay intan u yaalaan lafiisa haddaad tagto xawaadle dabadiisa waa ka yaala markaa u qarxay caruurtaydii la joogtay shuban caruur dhaxdintii dhacday marmar baan soo baxnaayo xaafadihii gubanayay meesha magaalada daqiiqa oo meel walba gubatay daarag hit meesha dhacday duhurkii ayaa guriga soo jeeda mid soo xabsay caruurtii yareeyay guriga ku jirtay dibadda taatay isla waqtigeedu ifaakeed galin guriga ay xidka labaad aad ugu qaystay kaasaan ku door baan soo yaacay waxaan wadanaa caruurtii ku sin ilma yaro curyaanaba 20 jiraan wadanaa wax baan wadanaa halkii baan habartaha ku taba jidka waxa looga talaabay idaacadii ku jiraano qofba marbu ka talaabay orod kaga talado meel walba dab baa ku xiran markaas aad caruurtii ilmaha dhabka haysa streetka goynaysa orod markii waxa la geeyay meel xarumo oo caafimaad ah waxa yaala meesha kii aligtu kulis family dhammaan inta madfici ku dhacay sandaqado oo ku jiray family dhan ayaa waxa inta ninun masfaatiray daarak hit qoysas dhan oo ku jiray guriyihii waxaan soo maray shirf shaaf loo tuuray shinkada furan ee madfici koosta sandaqada la leeyahay halka sandaqad baa ahayd ee baaba wax iban yar guriga daloola ee lagu laayay rasaasta gacanta ku taala iyo ta duubi iyo ka baabay adyaabto meeshii baan tagay dhaawac waxaan u tagay dadkii mid furso
oo meel lagu ururinayo marka
guriyo meel guriya weeyaan waa guri dambe guriyaha dambe idaacada irbadi ma taal suujar ma yaal waxaad wax ku tashaamay yaal goos ma taal markaas waxaan
dadkuna waa badan yihiin
sidaas loo daadsay markii kale raab lagu keenay raab lagu keenay si gawaad lagu soo quran inta dhabarka lagu soo qaado inta la soo jiido ka dhiig baxaya hal bawlaha furan waxa ay ugu horeysay gabadh inta taayar waxa ay dabadoo dhan ee saaqos farin di mijir ilaa wax walba kaas oo dhan waa qofkii horeeyay ka shaqeeyay
sax
markii aan arkay kolkii horeysay waxa soo saaray shaar nadiif oo igu jiray meesha waxa igu jiray tailoris scissors maqas ayaan sitay marka la soo baxay guriga labadii wax ku jirtay gooskii asaariyartii waxa shaarkii
ma baadayn wax kale
shaarkii
waa shaarkaagii baad u saartay way
shaarkii aniga meeshii ugu jiray
ee saar
dhowr soo jirno way nin kale oday kale isna sidoo kale iyo musqush ku jiray midfil ma sax dabadoo dhan ku way isna sidoo kale turtay isaga habeenkii yartii way seefeefay habeen iyo dharaar waan shaqeynay waan taagay operation kan diyaarnay waxaan markaa isku organize garay inaan helo material
sax
dawo iyo qalab infusions IV waxa loo xiyaan helo dhan aan loo keenay way store baan yeelan markii dambe saddex guri sikadan ayaa ku shaqeynay anaga halkii shaqeynayna maalintii dambe waxaan isbad garay diyaarad way duhur baan garanay anoo ka soo baxay meeshii lagu qalay oo qof saaray miiska ayaa saa ugu soo baxay markaan soo baxay guri labaad galay ayaa diyaaradda soo dhigtay xabirti شو أوريش كأنه بنوصل على سكدي بفستيفات كده واحد لو حير بيشن ككبناي ماشي لا هركي كويس.
After indiscriminate bombardment of Hargeise, the armed forces planned and carried out hot pursuit of survivors who fled the city, strafing them all the way to the Ethiopian border, killing whomever they found within the territory they controlled, sparing none, including the wounded, women and children. 2 years after the bombardment, the military regime collapsed. The surviving residents of Hargeise returned from refugee camps in Ethiopia, finding their city not only reduced to rubble, but their neighborhoods and streets full of landmines. They were ill-fed, ill-clad, homeless, and lacked other basic necessities of life. Many were also physically and psychologically disabled. Those spared visible injuries were jobless, uprooted, disoriented in the debris and ruin that surrounded them. Discovering that none were on the way to help them, they cleared the mines, street by street, block by block. They also restored peace, declared unilateral declaration of independence, and established self-governance which, after 4 elections and peaceful transition of power, made Somaliland a leading example of self-help and a beacon of democracy for a region plagued by violence and tyranny. Hargeise is today rebuilding and reclaiming its name as a hub of commerce and culture. One of the planes used to bombard the city is mounted in the city center to represent a symbol of the bygone days when the dictator and his cronies controlled the city, then destroyed it. Yet, despite efforts to forget, live in the here and now, and forge a better future, memories of the massacres and loss of loved ones persist. The trauma too lingers in flashbacks, terror nightmares, and frank madness of some survivors, leaving families to care for them and suffer with them. Then once in a while the past reasserts itself with vengeance, as was the case in 1997, when major floods exposed mass graves of residents whom the armed forces killed and buried in groups. The victims included religious leaders, intellectuals, businessmen, and ordinary people. Some relatives recognized the dead by their clothes, watches, and shoes, exhuming the pain and grief they thought they had overcome years ago. This woman recognized the shoes of her brother. The skeletal remains of individuals, like the ones keeping you and me upright and our organs protected, were collected in dump trucks, prepared for proper burial, and given last rites, reclaiming them as cherished members of the community. Aside from its religious significance, this communal burial was done to help the living overcome a past that refuses to vanish. Such chance discoveries and lingering mass trauma raise unanswered questions. What should be done with officials who were responsible for these crimes against humanity, some of whom live abroad, others in Somalia? When, where, and how will surviving relatives of victims have their day in court, not for revenge, but to overcome past injustice and communicate that such crimes will never be tolerated in the future? What hope exists when successive presidents of Somalia, instead of at least acknowledging crimes committed, protect and defend the officers who committed crimes against humanity? In whose name did these leaders request U.S. courts to grant diplomatic immunity for General Muhammad Ali Samatta, who by his own admission ordered the indiscriminate bombardment of Hargeise in 1988? Finally, what's the responsibility of the Somali public and the international community to ensure that such crimes do not repeat in the future? Answers to these questions, most of all concerted and rational action restoring justice, trust in government, and shared humanity with others outside the clan or one's faith, await a new outlook, a new resolve, and a new day which, for Somalis at least, do not loom on the horizon.